In 1980, war broke out between the Middle East's two preeminent powers, Iran and Iraq. Both countries were ruled at the time by leaders that recently came to power. Iraq's long-serving Vice President Saddam Hussein had assumed the presidency the year before, whilst Iran had just emerged from the throes of a revolution that culminated in Ayatollah Khomeini becoming the supreme leader. Starting with an invasion of Iran, the war soon moved into Iraqi soil, before devolving into a deadly stalemate that cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers on both sides. The conflict would prove to be one of the deadliest of the 20th century, with chemical weapons being used, as well as World War I-style trench warfare. The two combatants fought a war for the very existence of their regimes, so it is no surprise that both sides made deals with countries they deemed their enemies. All the while, the international community watched with bated breath as the Persian Gulf, the home of much of the world's supply of oil, became engulfed in war. In the 1970s, Iran was a modernizing nation on the rise. Its huge oil reserves brought an influx of cash which was then used to rapidly develop the country. Its longtime ruler, Mohammad Reza Shah, wanted Iran to recapture its past glory after seeing it be at the prey of European imperial powers for over a century. So he quickly sought to modernize the country's military. Spending billions of dollars, the Shah bought advanced weaponry and equipment from countries like the USA and UK. With its vast array of tanks, state-of-the-art fighter jets, and impressive warships, Iran was well on its way to becoming one of the world's most powerful military forces. Regionally, it became the preeminent power in the Middle East, thanks to its GDP and military. But beneath this picturesque surface, the country faced serious fundamental issues. Despite the massive windfall from oil, Iran's newfound wealth was only available to a select class as a result of the rampant nepotism that plagued the government. Those who were favored by the regime received lucrative contracts and positions facilitated by the oil boom. At the same time, the traditional forces within society were alienated by the Shah's ardent support for Iran's westernization. In 1978, tensions boiled over as huge protests led by the ulama started gathering momentum. From his exile, Ayatollah Khomeini soon emerged as the leader of the anti-regime movement. In a remarkable sequence of events, the Shah stepped down at the beginning of 1979, being replaced by Khomeini. The new supreme leader of Iran announced that the country was to be a theocracy, ruled by the ulama itself. For neighboring Iraq, 1979 was also a momentous year. Saddam Hussein, having already been the de facto ruler of the country for some years, officially became president. Just 2 weeks later, in July 1979, he publicly purged his Ba'athist party to assert dominance on the Iraqi political scene. In his capacity as vice president, Saddam had presided over Iraq's remarkable growth in the 1970s. In many ways, this progress mirrored the same that was experienced by Iran in this time period. In 1972, the Iraqi Petroleum Company was nationalized under the supervision of Saddam. A year later, both Iran and Iraq benefited hugely from the OPEC oil embargo, which saw the price of oil triple within a year. Subsequently, Saddam used the increased oil revenues to develop his country by building roads, schools, and hospitals. To go hand in hand with all this material growth, Saddam sought to assert his will on all of Iraqi society, leading him to invest heavily in his secret police. Similar to the Shah of Iran, Saddam also signed a series of arms deals with foreign countries to modernize his military, buying the latest tanks, fighter jets, and attack helicopters from countries like France and the USSR. As his emerging neighbor Iran was plunged into revolutionary frenzy, Saddam would watch with keen interest. He, like much of the ruling elite, was Sunni Muslim. Despite being excluded from the halls of power, Shia Muslims actually held a demographic majority. Therefore, the ascension of the Ayatollahs to power in Iran particularly worried Saddam about the prospect of his own Shia Iraqis rising up against him, especially since Khomeini championed the exportation of his revolutionary ideals abroad. The roots of the danger lay in Iraq's demographics. Despite being ruled by an entrenched Sunni minority, Iraq's population was predominantly Shia. For years, the Shia had been excluded from the halls of power, and they harbored bitter resentments about the discrimination they endured under the Sunni tribal elite. The Iraqi leader took this threat to his survival very seriously. In addition, the two countries had a long-standing feud over the Shatt al-Arab waterway at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. In 1975, Saddam had personally been involved in the Algiers Agreement, which saw Iraq concede its right to the waterway to the Shah. But he had signed this largely to put an end to the Kurdish rebellion within Iraq, which was sustained by Iranian support for the Kurds. Iran's new government may have been crackling with revolutionary zeal, but militarily they were weak. Saddam saw his opportunity to strangle the Ayatollah's threatening vision in its crib. As a result, on September 22, 1980, squadrons of Iraqi fighters swarmed into Iranian airspace and attacked a collection of bases near Tehran. The Iran-Iraq War had begun. Saddam had envisioned his air attack would have the same effect as the Israeli strikes did in the Six-Day War of 1967. Upon securing aerial superiority, he believed Iraqi victory would be swift and inevitable. Unfortunately for him, this did not materialize. The aerial attack was unsuccessful, only doing partial damage to the air bases and destroying an insignificant number of aircraft. Nevertheless, Saddam launched a ground invasion the very next day, attacking in 3 separate locations in the north, center, and south. Much of the Iraqi manpower was dedicated to the southern attack, which targeted Iran's Arab-dominated Khuzestan province, in the process fully securing the Shatt al-Arab. Almost immediately, the Khuzestani cities of Khorramshahr and Abadan were besieged. Both sieges would be protracted and delayed the Iraqi offensive, thus giving Iran sufficient time to stabilize and calculate its strategy. Although Khorramshahr would be captured by the end of October, the Iraqi offensive was seriously delayed by outnumbered Iranian units who fought tooth and nail to defend the city. Abadan, the site of the famous refinery, took even longer, with the siege being dragged out until September 1981 and ending in an Iranian victory. Right from the get-go, Saddam was surprised by the Iranian response. Considering the political turbulence the country had experienced in the previous few years, he had almost assumed Iran would wither from the pressure of an external attack and internal upheaval from ordinary Iranians. Instead, what he found was a disjointed nation that was galvanized by a foreign aggressor. Domestically, Ayatollah Khomeini was facing serious threats from all directions. The MEK were launching attacks on high-ranking members of the regime. Even amongst the ulama, there was dissension with Khomeini's strict vision. Segments of Iranian society itself was becoming alienated with the Islamic Republic as it slowly realized it had replaced one dictator in the Shah with another in Khomeini. But rather than capitulating, Ayatollah Khomeini saw an opportunity to secure his Islamic revolution. The military investments made by the Shah in the previous few decades meant that the country still retained fairly sophisticated weaponry. The Iranian response was decisive. In fact, just 2 hours after the initial Iraqi airstrike, Iranian fighter jets responded with their own attack. 2 months later, in November, Operation Morvarid prevented Iraqi dominance over the Persian Gulf and destroyed much of the Iraqi navy. This meant Iraq could not entirely blockade the port of Abadan, allowing Iran to resupply it by sea and thereby directly contributing to the siege's eventual failure. From early 1981 onwards, Iraqi offensives essentially stalled. In January of that year, it was Iran's turn to go on the offensive, launching Operation Nasr. The brainchild of President Bani Sadr, it was intended to drive the Iraqis out of Khuzestan. But internal turmoil within the new Iranian government meant that the operation would end up becoming a disastrous failure. Upon ascending to power, Khomeini had purged the military of officers whose loyalties he doubted. Countless senior officers were imprisoned, executed, or fled abroad. At the same time, he had established the Sepah Pastaran, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, to ensure the protection of the Islamic Republic. This resulted in a rivalry between the army and the IRGC. To further confound matters, this rivalry took shape politically as the moderate President Bani Sadr supported the army, whilst more hardliner members of the government supported the Revolutionary Guards. So when Operation Nasr failed, it set off a chain of events within Iran. Bani Sadr's opponents were emboldened, soon after impeaching him in June 1981. Knowing firsthand what happened to those who fell afoul of the regime, Bani Sadr decided to flee the country. From this point on, Iran's government was unified under Islamist hardliners who would intensify their grip on power over the next few years by eliminating all rivals. From 1980 to 1983, the regime launched the Cultural Revolution, seeking to root out nonconformist thought amongst institutions of higher education. Universities were shut down for this period, students and teachers were purged. Dissident groups like the MEK would fight back by unleashing a wave of high-profile attacks on prominent figures of the regime. An attack on the Prime Minister's office in August 1981 left both the new President Raja'i and Prime Minister Bahunar dead. Even the current Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, was the target of an assassination attempt a few months earlier in June 1981. The MEK would go on to collaborate with Saddam from 1983 onwards. This revolutionary crisis mode would come to pass by 1983, and it was to benefit Iran's war effort against Iraq. The rivalry between the army and the IRGC would also dissipate, thereby making coordinated attacks between the two branches of the military smoother. Already by May 1982, Saddam's forces had been driven out of Iranian land. At this point, Saddam's strategy changed from holding territory within Iran to not losing any within Iraq. Immediately, he tried to sue for peace. But Khomeini was uninterested, seeing the benefits the war had brought for his regime. The Iranians did, however, have a major problem on their hands. Ever since the hostage crisis of 1979, they had been facing severe international sanctions from the US and its allies. This meant replacing weapon parts was extremely difficult, an issue they sought to fix by cannibalizing parts from other machinery and turning to the black market. To highlight the complexity of geopolitics, Israel became one of the biggest suppliers of arms to Iran during the war. The Israelis first got permission from the Americans for these arms sales, which totaled to tens of billions of dollars. When Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin launched an attack on Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor in 1981, it was done with Iranian intelligence. So even though publicly the Ayatollahs maintained an antagonistic stance towards Israel, and despite America publicly supporting the sanctions on Iran, through backdoor means they did the opposite. The US also secretly sold arms to Iran. In 1986, the Iran-Contra affair came to light and shocked the world. Under the Reagan administration, America had been selling weapons to Iran and using the funds to finance the Nicaraguan Contras, right-wing rebels fighting against the Marxist Sandinista government. This was all the more embarrassing because of Operation Staunch in 1983, where the US tried to diplomatically pressure other countries not to sell Iran arms. Besides these clandestine transactions, Iran mainly relied on China, Libya, and Syria for support in arms and logistical equipment. Iraq, on the other hand, received much more international support. Around the time that the war moved from Iranian to Iraqi soil, the oil-rich Gulf countries like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia started providing Saddam with massive loans, fearing Tehran's warlike and revolutionary regime would harm their own interests. Syria was one of the only Arab countries to stand behind Iran, shutting down the Kirkuk-Banias pipeline from 1982 onwards, resulting in a catastrophic loss of capital for Saddam, losing billions of dollars every month. But support from the Gulf countries prevented Iraq from bankruptcy, with some estimating Saudi loans alone to be $1 billion per month. In addition, Saddam also received a lot of support from the USSR and Western countries such as France and West Germany. In 1982, America normalized relations with Iraq and went on to provide the Iraqi dictator with military intelligence as well as selling arms to him. It was crucial for US interests in the Middle East for Iraq to not lose the war, because it would destabilize neighboring countries which had pro-American governments, not to mention the massive impact an Iranian victory would have on the oil industry. Iran's invasion of Iraq convinced Saddam that he had to pursue a policy of total war, gearing the entire society for Iraq's defense. So he drafted even more soldiers into both the regular Iraqi army and the Iraqi Popular Army, a paramilitary force consisting of civilian volunteers. At the start of the war, Iran held a clear manpower advantage, but by 1984, the forces were equal in numbers. Just 2 years later, Iraq's forces were significantly higher than their foe, and by the end of the war in 1988, Iraq's army numbered 1 million soldiers, perhaps more, whilst Iran had almost half that number. Saddam used this numerical advantage by employing a defense-in-depth strategy, creating multiple lines of defense that intended to bleed the Iranians through attrition. This was especially effective against the Iranian strategy of human wave attacks, whereby their infantry would try to overwhelm Iraqi defense lines with sheer numbers. Once parity in army sizes was reached, these attacks were favored less by the Iranian high command anyway. The Iranian objective was to break the Iraqi resolve to fight, but buoyed by funding and weapons from the West and the Gulf monarchies, Iraq remained resolute. Even when the Iranians teamed up with the Peshmerga, the Iraqi Kurdish resistance movement, to open up a new front in the north, the deadlock could not be broken. From 1982 until 1988, the conflict consisted of constant Iranian offensives that were rebuffed by a determined Iraqi defense. Unconventional warfare became normalized as the two sides settled into a World War I-like trench warfare. Both sides began targeting civilians, with their air forces attacking major cities from the opposing side in order to terrorize the civilian population. From 1984 onwards, the two countries began targeting each other's ability to export oil in the Persian Gulf, as the global financial system watched nervously. By 1987, American warships intervened by escorting Kuwaiti tankers which were being attacked by the Iranians. Saddam also gave the green light for the use of chemical weapons, with his close relationship to the USA emboldening him to do so without fear of consequences. The most deadly usage of these came just before the war ended, when Saddam decided to address the Kurds living in the north. Accusing them of being a fifth column for collaborating with Iran, he unleashed a brutal campaign against them in 1987. The height of this operation was in March 1988 in the town of Halabja, where Iraqi planes dropped chemical munitions on defenseless inhabitants who could not outrun the roiling clouds of gas. In a single day, 5,000 men, women and children were killed, 10,000 more were injured. Whilst it did earn him the ire of the international community, the Kurds were pacified for the time being. Saddam could now turn his attention back to the Iranian front. By 1988, Iran was exhausted, unable to keep up with Iraq and its powerful allies. By July of that year, Saddam's forces had reversed the small Iranian gains within the country. The key southern port city of Basra, which had been besieged multiple times, was now out of danger. Later that month, Khomeini begrudgingly accepted a ceasefire, and by August 1988, the war was over. Up to 1 million Iraqis and Iranians were dead, 700,000 were injured. Neither side gained any territory or anything else for that matter, but both sides lost a great deal. For Iran, whilst the war solidified the Ayatollah's grip on power, they had lost human capital as well as a tremendous amount of money, which was compounded by the heavy sanctions already placed on them from the international community. For Iraq, it had entered the war as a rapidly modernizing country that was the envy of most of its neighbors, but now found itself as yet another war-torn third world country. To make matters worse, the loans given to Iraq by its rich Gulf neighbors were going to be recalled, meaning that it was now going to face bankruptcy. Saddam's response to Kuwait asking for its money led to the Gulf War just 2 years later, at which point Iraq suffered the same fate as Iran, becoming an international pariah, as its erstwhile ally America turned on Saddam by vilifying him. Thank you guys for watching. As usual, thank you to my patrons for your continued support. Until next time, peace!